Okay, we're going to move to Selma. And here's our map of Alabama, and as you know, I like maps. Birmingham, Selma, and of course the famous road we're going to talk about on the march from Selma to Montgomery. Monday, September 16th, 1963, the day after the Birmingham bombing, 63 protesters went to the Dallas County, Alabama courthouse, which is Selma, to protest. There they were met by Sheriff Jim Clark and Al Lingo, the director of Alabama State Troopers, who arrested and in some instances beat a number of the protesters. The next day, teenagers marched in yet another demonstration challenging the previous day's event, and many of them were also arrested and beaten by Clark and his deputies, several of whom had cattle prods that were used with impunity. And a cattle prod is electrified and is used to move cattle by poking them in the rear end. These are not nice instruments. Selma was then to be the next objective for voter registration. There are about 15,000 eligible black voters in Selma, but only about 200 were registered to vote. And I think what's even more perplexing, reading the New York Times the past couple of days, the number of voters in Selma is going down, 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 and I'm afraid that may be attributed to the fact that even if they vote, they're going to get outvoted and they see no change. And I think this is a real problem in the absence of national legislation to effect the necessary changes to give people the equal opportunities that Kennedy was talking about in 1963. On September 23rd, there was a mass meeting at the Tabernacle Baptist Church with over 1,000 black citizens in attendance. This gathering had the response of Al Lingo having 50 state troopers armed with machine guns surround the church, but no arrests were made. On the 24th, 30 men and women were arrested for demonstrating in front of the courthouse. The response was an even larger demonstration that resulted in over 300 people being jailed. The registrar's office for voter registration was open only the first and third Mondays of each month, and these became known as Freedom Mondays. Scores of would-be voters stood in line for blocks, waiting their turn before the registrar. Literacy tests were given to black applicants. Now, last week you had some firsthand experience with an Alabama literacy test, and I doubt that anybody in here got 100. Only you know how well you scored. My wife was nice enough to tell me that even though she graduated cum laude from Bryn Mawr, which was and is a very prestigious score, she might have not passed the literacy test. She didn't pass the literacy test. So now there was an alternative to the literacy test, because in some instances, voters were asked to count the number of jelly beans in a jar or the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. The registrar was the czar, and there was no right of appeal from his decision. And do I say, quote, his and not his or hers? Yes, because virtually all administrative supervisory positions were staffed by white males. A mass voter registration drive was set for October 7, 1963, designated as Freedom Day. It was hot that day, but no one was allowed to leave the line for water or to use the bathroom. Even if they had been, colored bathrooms were locked. And everything in the South in those days was labeled white and colored. I mean, water fountains, buses, restrooms, virtually everything. And, you know, in the 1940s, when I was a child, I thought it was that way every place. That's all I ever saw. So how was I to know there was any difference? And I think that was true of a lot of people. If people were to leave the line, they would not be allowed to return. Two organizers approached Sheriff Clark about bringing water and food to those in line. And, quote, Sheriff Clark, it doesn't seem like a very Christian thing to let people drop dead on your courthouse steps, end quote. To which the sheriff responded, and again a quote, if they're so thirsty, then they can get out of line and get something to drink. Ain't nobody stopping them, but if I see any of you niggers trying to bring them anything, if I see you so much as talking to them, I'll arrest you for molesting people trying to register to vote. Now, what's so scary, let's look at the current Georgia legislation that's been passed this last year or this year, I can't remember which, but certainly within the last year, and see what their sanctions are and what they're allowed to do as to bringing water to people who are standing in line. And here we are, how many years later? At 4:30, the courthouse closed and few were registered, but there was a successful nonviolent protest, and this is what I call Selma number 1. Everybody in this room knows exactly where we were and what we were doing on November 22nd of 1963. Previously, we have explored what was known as Freedom Summer in 1964, and with all of the national outrage, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, but not without a great deal of difficulty. This was proposed by Kennedy on June 11th, and we saw the film clip of it, and it was ultimately passed by Johnson, and we're going to see his little film clip, which is much shorter.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American. 188 years ago this week, a small band of valiant men began a long struggle for freedom. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, not only to found a nation, but to forge an ideal of freedom, not only for political independence, but for personal liberty, not only to eliminate foreign rule, but to establish the rule of justice in the affairs of men. That struggle was a turning point in our history. Today, in far corners of distant continents, the ideals of those American patriots still shape the struggles of men who hunger for freedom. This is a proud triumph. Yet those who founded our country knew that freedom would be secure only if each generation fought to renew and enlarge its meaning. From the Minutemen at Concord to the soldiers in Vietnam, each generation has been equal to that trust. Americans of every race and color have died in battle to protect our freedom. Americans of every race and color have worked to build a nation of widening opportunities. Now, our generation of Americans has been called on to continue the unending search for justice within our own borders. We believe that all men are created equal, yet many are denied equal treatment. We believe that all men have certain unalienable rights, yet many Americans do not enjoy those rights. We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty, yet millions are being deprived of those blessings, not because of their own failures, but because of the color of their skin. The reasons are deeply embedded in history and tradition and the nature of man. We can understand without rancor or hatred how this all happened, but it cannot continue. Our Constitution, the foundation of our republic, forbids it. The principles of our freedom forbid it. Morality forbids it. And the law I will sign tonight forbids it. That law is the product of months of the most careful debate and discussion. It was proposed more than 1 year ago by our late and beloved President, John F. Kennedy. It received the bipartisan support of more than 2/3 of the members of both the House and the Senate. An overwhelming majority of Republicans, as well as Democrats, voted for it. It has received the thoughtful support of tens of thousands of civic and religious leaders in all parts of this nation. And it is supported by the great majority of the American people.
But there was resistance, and it was best expressed by Senator Richard Russell, Democrat of Georgia, who in launching a filibuster to prevent its passage was quoted as saying, quote, "We will resist to the bitter end any measure or any movement which would have a tendency to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of the races in our states." And while these words rang, President Johnson also opined that this would spell the end of the Democratic Party in the South. And these prescient remarks have proved to be true. Growing up in the 40s, 50s, you had primaries, but the Democratic primary was the election. General election, almost nobody voted because there were no Republican candidates. That's how one-sided it was in the South. And a lot of that was a hangover from Reconstruction. A lot of people that I knew revered their grandparents who had lived through Reconstruction and whose reaction to Reconstruction was that they could never, ever support a Republican. All of that has flip-flopped completely. Today you have a smaller Democratic base, but you do have a general election with Democrats and Republicans. You have in your handout a transcript of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Let's go to Selma number 2. Notwithstanding the Civil Rights Act, voting throughout the South was still a challenge, again centered on Selma. On December 28, 1964, Martin Luther King proposed something that would be known as the Project for an Alabama Political Freedom Movement. This was an attempt for all the various civil rights organizations to unify in drawing the country's attention to overt voter suppression. State Circuit Judge James Albert O'Hare had issued an injunction that effectively limited the rights to gather, march, and protest voting rights suppression. At the same time, Selma had just elected an individual by the name of Joe Smotherman as mayor. Smotherman's objective was to attract outside business interests to locate and thus invest in Selma. Smotherman appointed Wilson Baker as chief of police because Baker's response to protesters was much less violent than that of Sheriff Clark. Clark, of course, was still the county sheriff. On January 2nd, 1965, a mass meeting was held at the Brown Chapel AME Church, with the crowd overflowing the capacity of the church. Even with the injunction, no one was arrested. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee joined forces and organized over 400 men and women to attempt to enter the courthouse and register to vote on January 18th. No one was allowed in the courthouse, and no one was registered to vote. Dr. King himself led this effort and was confronted by white supremacists, including the founder of the American Nazi Party, one George Lincoln Rockwell. In fact, when King was attempting to become the first black to register at the Hotel Albert in Selma, Rockwell assaulted him, with the assault being stopped by Wilson Baker, the police chief. On January 19th, the voter line resumed, and while on the previous day the sheriff ordered the line to go through the alley, on this day, the 19th, leadership had enough and demanded to be allowed to line up and enter the courthouse through the front door. Can you imagine? Front door not being open to you because you're black? In response, Clark ordered the arrest of those in line, and subsequently over 60 were in fact arrested, including a teacher by the name of Margaret Moore, who, as you see, is white. And she was very, very popular teacher. And as a result, all the school teachers in Selma, and they were all white in those days, in the white schools, all black in the black schools, turned out in protest, which left the schools no recourse but to suspend classes. That got everybody's attention. You know what happens when you can't send your children to school. All of these made national news, and on January 25th, there were 250 people picketing the courthouse. One Annie Lee Cooper, who was shoved by a white policeman, actually hit back, and she was severely beaten. The incident was described in the New York Times thusly, quote, "I wish you had hit me, you scum," she snapped at the sheriff. He then brought his billy club down on her head with a whack that was heard throughout the crowd gathered at the street, end quote. And this is a reenactment with Oprah Winfrey portraying her in the movie Selma. On February 1, 1965, Dr. King and 250 men and women marching with him were arrested, along with about 500 school children. Now, where they put all these people in a jail in this county in Alabama, I don't know. With all the publicity, courtesy of the national press, on February 5th, a congressional delegation of 15 congressmen, including Charles Diggs and John Conyers, arrived along with John Lindsay, the mayor of New York, former mayor of New York, and the current mayor, Ed Koch. This is the publicity that the marchers wanted, and King was, in fact, released from jail that day. But this didn't deter Sheriff Clark, who on that very day arrested at least another 500 marchers, and several days later arrested 150 teenagers and sent them on a 2-mile forced run with deputies using clubs and cattle prods that we've talked about before to keep the procession moving. This included one 9-year-old boy who had been forced to run these 2 miles with no shoes. As a result, John Lewis sent out this press release. Sheriff Clark proved today, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he is basically no different from a Gestapo officer doing the fascist slaughter of the Jews. This is but one more example of the inhuman, animal-like treatment of the Negro people of Selma, Alabama. This nation has always come to the aid of people in foreign lands who are gripped by a reign of tyranny. Can this nation do less for the people of Selma? Clark himself was feeling physical pressure and checked himself into a local hospital. A group of black school children showed up with signs reading, quote, "Get well soon in mind as in body," end quote, as well as signs reading, "Freedom now." When released from the hospital, Clark wore a badge with a one-word message: never. Protests continued, and on February 16th, Clark confronted Reverend C.T. Vivian, who held a top position with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and who dared Clark to hit him. Clark took the bait hit Vivian, knocking him down the courthouse steps, but he, Clark, broke a finger in his hand and then went on to have Vivian arrested. 2 days later, on February 18th, in neighboring Perry County, Vivian was asked to speak to a local church, and over 450 people were in attendance. Also, there were reporters, including John Herbers from the New York Times and Richard Valeriani from NBC. Following the speech, it was the plan to march to the city jail in protest of the confinement of one James Orange of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. As soon as the march began, the street lights went out. Local police, state troopers, and Jim Clark, as well as some of his cronies, fell upon the marchers, spraying TV cameras with paint and beating the marchers with sticks and clubs. One young black man, Jamie Lee Jackson, was shot in the stomach, and after lying on the sidewalk for about half an hour, was finally taken to a hospital, one that admitted blacks. And this is one of those markers commemorating the killing of Jamie Lee Jackson. The killing of Jamie Lee Jackson, December 16th, 1938, birth date, February 26, 1965, happened behind the Zion Methodist Church in Marion, Alabama on February 18, 1965. He didn't die from the Alabama State Trooper's gunshot wound to the stomach right away, but 8 days later, on February 26, 28 miles away in Selma, Alabama. According to Sister Michael Ann, an administrator at Good Samaritan Hospital in Selma, the powder burns on his clothes were evidence Jamie Lee was shot twice at close range, and his death spurred a suggestion. A suggestion was made that the casket containing the body be taken to Montgomery and laid on the Capitol steps. While he was buried, the idea of a march was born, and the due date was to be Sunday, March 7th, 1965. We are now March 7th, 2022, 57 years later. Originally, King was to lead the march, but he felt the need to be in his Atlanta church on that date and advocated postponing it until Monday the 8th. His Confederates, including Hosea Williams and Andy Young, were in Selma, ready and wanting to proceed. And proceed they did, with over 600 setting out to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and proceed the 54 miles to Montgomery. They were confronted, and I can't summarize it, but I can read from John Lewis' book, Walking with the Wind. There, when we reached the crest of the bridge, I stopped dead still. So did Hosea. It's Hosea Williams. There, facing us at the bottom of the other side, stood a sea of blue-helmeted, blue-uniformed Alabama state troopers. Line after line of them, dozens of battle-ready lawmen stretched from one side of U.S. Highway 80 to the other. Behind them were several dozen more armed men, Sheriff Clark's posse, some on horseback, all wearing khaki clothing, many carrying clubs, the sign of baseball bats. On one side of the road, I could see a crowd of about 100 whites laughing and hollering, waving Confederate flags. Beyond them, at a safe distance, stood a small, silent group of black people. It was a drop of 100 feet from the top of that bridge to the next blow. Hosea glanced down at the muddy water and said, "Can you swim?" "No," I answered. "Well," he said with a tiny half smile, "neither can I." "But," he added, lifting his head and looking straight ahead, "we might have to." Then we moved forward. The only sounds were our footsteps on the bridge and the snorting of a horse ahead of us. I noticed several troopers slipping gas masks over their faces as we approached. At the bottom of the bridge, while we were still about 50 feet from the troopers, the officer in charge, a Major John Cloud, stepped forward holding a small bullhorn up in his mouth. Hosea and I stopped, which brought the others to a standstill. Quote, "This is an unlawful assembly," Cloud pronounced. "Your march is not conducive to the public safety. You are ordered to disperse and go back to your church or to your home." "May we have a word with the major?" asked Hosea. "There is no word to be had," answered Cloud. Hosea asked the same question again and got the same response. Then Cloud issued a warning. "You have 2 minutes to turn around and go back to your home." We could have gone forward, marching right into the teeth of those troopers, but that would have been too aggressive, I thought, too provocative. God knew what might happen if we had done that. These people were ready to be arrested, but I didn't want anyone to get hurt. We couldn't go forward, we couldn't go back. There was only one option, and I said we should kneel and pray. We turned and passed the word back to begin bowing down in a prayerful manner. But that word didn't get far. It didn't have time. 1 minute after he had issued his warning, I know this because I was careful to check my watch, Mayor Cloud issued an order to his troopers. Troopers, he barked, advanced, and then all hell broke loose. Fortuitously, all of this mayhem was covered by ABC television, and just about 9:30 p.m. Sunday evening, they cut into their premiere broadcast, Judgment in Nuremberg, with Frank Reynolds coming on the screen, announcing and then showing a 15-minute clip of the brutal clash that had taken place that day in Selma. In fact, at one point in the film clip, the voice of Sheriff Clark could distinctly be heard, quote, "Get those goddamn niggers," and "get those goddamn white niggers," end quote. Somehow that clip and that language finally touched the nerves of the American public more than all scenes that had previously occurred as the dogs attacking teenagers and fire hoses used on marches. The sight of riders on horseback rolling over lines of silent people was more than the public was willing to accept. And here are some of the shots. This is the confrontation. Gas mask, tear gas, and tear gas is no fun. And we're going to have a short video. There is no sound to it because while we have the still shots, nothing can take the place of a motion picture. And this is a very short video of what took place on Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 57 years ago today.
They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've been struggling so long. We must be free. We must be free. They say that freedom is a constant crying. They say that freedom is a constant crying. They say that freedom dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. Oh Lord, we've been dying so long. We must be free.
He is trying to remind the nation of the urgency of now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to transform Alabama, the heart of victory, to a state with the heart of brotherhood and peace and goodwill.
Dr. King, now in Atlanta, vowed that there would be a march from Selma to Montgomery. By the end of the month, less than 60 people were allowed in the courthouse in an attempt to register, and not a single one succeeded. On March 16th, Judge Frank Jackson in the federal district court sitting in Montgomery granted an injunction prohibiting interference with the next planned march, which was to take place on Sunday, March 21st, 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday. They had 5 days to prepare the logistics, which was quite a daunting task to assemble air mattresses, blankets, porta potties, water, food for thousands. But it was done, and at the order of President Johnson, 1,800 federalized National Guardsmen, 2,000 U.S. Army troops, 100 FBI agents, and 100 U.S. Marshals for protection. The march began. 3,200 people set forth, covering 7 miles the first day. The second day, only 300 marchers were allowed per Judge Jackson's order because of a narrow road in Lowndes County. But this smaller group covered 16 miles. The third day, the number of marchers swelled to around 3,000, and they covered 11 miles. The fourth day, 16 miles to the outskirts of Montgomery. There, the marchers were greeted by Dr. King and a welcoming crowd of some 1,500. And here we're going to interrupt this somewhat. We're going to show the first 3 minutes and then another 5 or 6 minutes of the march.
make us free.
The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I
in decent, safe, and sanitary housing.
Yes, sir.
Let us march on segregated schools.
Let us march.
Until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites study side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. Let us march on poverty.
Let us march.
Until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their children may eat.
Yes, sir.
Let us march on ballot boxes.
Yes, march.
March on ballot boxes until race baiters disappear from the political arena. Let us march on ballot boxes until the Sadian misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs
Yes, sir.
will be transformed into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens.
Speak, doctor.
Let us march on ballot
Let us
boxes
march.
until the Wallaces of our nation tremble away in silence. Let us march on ballot boxes.
It's a little bit long, but the march was long. How many people did the whole 50 some odd miles? I don't know. And one of the things that stood out to me as they reached Montgomery, and maybe I'm the only one that would pick up on it, just because of where I came from, was the housing. If you notice the housing, that was an example of all of the housing for black people of which I was aware in Chattanooga, Tennessee, till 1954, when my father, to his credit, built some responsible, respectable housing for black families. It wasn't that much, but he was a Depression-type person and vowed that as a result of the Depression that he would never, ever owe anybody anything. Now, it's interesting to note that on the third day of the march, Harry Belafonte, that we talked about prior sessions, organized a concert with performers including Nina Simone, Sammy Davis Jr., Billy Eckstein, Leonard Bernstein, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary. On the 25th, the marchers reached Montgomery with about 50,000 going to see Governor Wallace, and the marchers made their point. The Voting Rights Act passed. Unfortunately, hatred had not disappeared. Following the rally on the Capitol steps, Viola Liuzzo was shuttling marchers back and forth from Montgomery to Selma when pursuers pulled up alongside her car where they shot and killed her. The perpetrators were Klansmen, one of whom was none other than Gary Thomas Rowe, that we talked about as a possible suspect in the bombing of the church in Birmingham, and who was an FBI informant of questionable character. I say questionable because this is most discouraging. The FBI was in the process of smearing King and instigated rumors that Liuzzo was a communist, heroin addict, had abandoned her children, and had sexual relationships with African Americans involved in the civil rights movement. And it was the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1963. It's the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2022. And just who was Edmund Pettus? He was actually in California in the late 1840s. And there were Native Americans here, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Y-U-K-I, Yuki tribe. There were about 10,000. By the time he got done, there were 300. He graduated into the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Following the war, he became Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Following that stint, the Alabama legislature elected him to the United States Senate. And remember, in those days, senators were chosen by state legislators, not by popular vote. And it's still the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Here is Carolyn Randall Williams. She's a native of Nashville, Tennessee. She went to a very prestigious prep school in New Hampshire, graduated from Harvard. She's now on the faculty at Vanderbilt University. And this quote really, really hit me. The black people I come from were owned and raped by the white people I come from.
Yep.
Think about that. The black people I come from were owned and raped by the white people I come from. Well, let's kind of end this on a more pleasant note. Remember the lady that was beaten so badly by the police in Selma? Here she is on the 50th anniversary of the march to Selma, hand in hand with the President of the United States, again crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Well, next week we move to Memphis, and we will conclude with that tale that went on and on and on, to which I was an eyewitness to too much of it. Thank you all.